All right. A couple songs. That's good. Out here, Chris. I have never seen this song. But the thing is, he showed me where I'm wrong. But I'm wrong. And I thought if we use it, maybe. Oh yeah.
You finally whacked him on his head. Yeah. Did you put any sense into it? No. Wow. I told him all my kids are good with it. She already got it. I had to open them for her. I love your dress.
Okay, this is what you say. So today's balance is in the
I like
Yeah. That makes it worse. Good morning, everyone. Before I begin, Richard, would you start us off with a word of prayer?
Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for this time to come here to look at thy word, study it, apply it to our lives. We pray for the teacher of the hour. May he have a regular recollection of things that he has prepared. We as listeners and we as looking into the word, see it to be true and apply it to our lives and live daily and to be. Be with the ones that are unable to be here through sickness. May they regain their health to where they can assemble once again and continue to learn thy word. Be with the ones that are traveling, keep them safe to and fro. Bring them back to us safely. We're thankful for your son and for all the many things that he has done for us, dying on the cross for our behalf. We ask this prayer in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
Okay, let's open up our Bibles to Matthew chapter 7. And on Wednesday evening, we studied verses 24 through 27. And talked about the wise man and the foolish man, which comes to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And that's been quite a study. In my opinion, I thought a very
informative study, going through the Sermon on the Mount and all the things that Jesus had brought up and the different things that we can apply to our lives. But we've come to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Now from verses 28 and 29, we're going to see the reaction of the crowd to Jesus' teachings. We're going to read Matthew 7, verses 28 and 29. And Charles, would you read those? Charles, Matthew 7, 28 and 29.
Chapter 7, 28, 29.
Yes.
And it came to pass when Jesus had ended, he said, the people were astonished at his doctrine. For he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribe.
Okay, what was the reaction to his teaching?
We're astonished.
Astonished, yes. And the Greek word that's translated astonished here, it's found 13 times in the New Testament. In the King James Version, 10 of those times it's translated astonished. And the other 3, it's translated amazed. So we can get the idea of what they're talking about here. Being utterly amazed or even dumbfounded, left at a loss from witnessing the incredible, overwhelmed. So these people were, in a word, overwhelmed with Jesus' teaching. And that's how good of a teacher he was. And this wasn't just one time that people were amazed and astonished with Jesus' teaching. This same word is used over and over when it comes to Jesus when he gets done teaching. Not just his works. I'm just talking about just his teaching. Because there's many, many verses that we can read. He did a miracle, and of course the people were astonished. But when it came just to his teaching, many, many times we read that the people were astonished, overwhelmed with his teaching. And we're going to read a few of those this morning, and then we'll move on. But let's turn now to Matthew chapter 22, and we'll read verse 33. Matthew 22 and verse 33. Louise, would you read that?
And when the multitude heard it, they were astonished at his teaching.
Okay, just another verse that says they were astonished. And this is the same original Greek word that we were just read in Matthew chapter 7. So we don't know how many people were gathered there on the Sermon on the Mount. And here we have multitudes again. Many, many people. And they were just overwhelmed with Jesus' teaching. Now let's flip over to Mark chapter 1. And we'll read verses 21 and 22. Mark 1, verses 21 and 22. And June, would you read those?
They went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and began to teach. They were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes.
Okay, here now he goes into the synagogue. He's not just out teaching a bunch of people that maybe weren't concerned with religious things, but the other two, they definitely listened. They were astonished. Now he goes into the synagogue, and of course he did this often and read and taught. And here again, people there in the synagogue, they're astonished. Again, the same Greek word that we read in Matthew 7. They were overwhelmed with Jesus' teachings. Now let's turn to Mark chapter 11. And we'll read verse 18. Mark 11, verse 18. Bob, would you read that?
And the scribes and the chief priests heard and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his doctrine.
Okay, here we have the scribes and the chief priests. And they were listening to him. Well, this is right after he overturned the tables and kicked them out of the temple. What they were doing things they shouldn't be doing. And they heard about all this, and they were scared of Jesus because he was reaching people. People were astonished. They were overwhelmed with his teaching, and they feared him and wanted to destroy him. Rather than listening to him, what they should have been, but that's the reaction they had to him. Let's turn over now to John chapter 4. John chapter 4, we'll be reading from verses 39 through 42. And Jesus here is in Samaria at Jacob's well, and he meets this woman and teaches her. This is the woman that said she didn't have a husband, and Jesus said, "Yeah, you're right. You have had 5. The one you have now is not your husband." And he teaches her there some, and then she goes on and tells the people in the town, "This man knew everything about me." So now we'll be continuing on here. John chapter 4, verses 39 through 42. Thad, would you read those?
And many of the Samaritans of that city believed on him for the sake of the woman which testified. He told me all that I ever did. So when the Samaritans were coming to him, they besought him that he would tarry with them. And he abode 2 days. And many were believed because of his own word. And said unto the woman, "Now believe, not because of thy sayings, for we have heard him himself, and know that this is indeed the Christ, the Savior of the world."
Okay, there were some here, it says that they believed just because of what the woman had said. And then others, they wanted to go. They went to him and said, "Okay, we want to hear from you." And they go and listen to him. And then in the end is what? Verse 42, "We ourselves have heard him, and we know that this is indeed the Christ, the Savior of the world." So his teaching again, just in a few days here, was it 2 days? He convinced all these people that he was the Christ with his teaching. So again, Jesus was an excellent teacher, and people were overwhelmed by his teaching. But it wasn't just the people that were overwhelmed. Even his enemies were overwhelmed. Let's turn over now and read a few verses again from Matthew chapter 22. Those that didn't want to listen, those that wanted to cause problems, they still were amazed at what his teachings. Matthew chapter 22 again, and we'll just read verse 22. This is after they're trying to test him and ask him if they should pay taxes or not. And of course, he tells them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's." And this is their reaction, verse 22. Matthew 22, verse 22. Nikki, would you read that?
When they had heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way.
Okay, again, and these are the people that are trying to trick him into speech. And it says here that they marveled and left. They didn't have nothing to say. They didn't know what to say. He was, of course, the wisdom that he had, they were playing a battle of wits, and they were unarmed in that way. They were coming up against Jesus. But again, here, all they wanted to do is cause problems, and they didn't know what to say. They were amazed, and they just walked away. But we see the same thing here. After the Pharisees had their shot, the Sadducees come up, and they try to test Jesus, starting in verse 23. And the end result we see in verse 34. After the Sadducees get done, let's read now from Matthew 22 and verse 34. And Michelle, would you read that?
But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together.
Okay, not only did he silence the Pharisees, they just walked away. Now he silenced the Sadducees with his teaching. And now the Pharisees are going, together. What are we going to do? We don't know what to do, this guy. We don't know how to answer him. So again, his knowledge and his wisdom, the way he taught was pretty overwhelming. And then in the bottom line is in the last verse of this chapter, verse 46. Let's read from Matthew 22, verse 46. Richard, would you read that?
Matthew 22,
46.
46. And no man was able to answer him a word, neither durst any man from that day forth ask him any more questions.
Okay, the knowledge that he had and then the wisdom and the way he taught. They didn't even want to ask him any more questions. They were scared to because he made them look bad, because he answered it and they didn't have an answer for him. So again, we know he's our perfect example of how we should live our life, but Jesus also was an amazing teacher. When he taught, people were overwhelmed, and even the people that didn't want to listen, they didn't have an answer for him. They just had to walk away, even when they wanted to be argumentative. We'll read one more and then we'll move on. Let's turn over to John chapter 7. John chapter 7, we'll start off by reading verse 32, and then we'll read verses 45 and 46. Roger, would you read those?
7:30. The Pharisees heard the crowd murmuring these things concerning him. And the Pharisees, the chief priests, and officers to take
45 and 46.
And the officers came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, "Why have you not brought him?" The officers answered, "No man ever spoke like this man."
Okay, we have the chief priests, the Pharisees. They sent these officers basically to arrest Jesus. And they go and they hear Jesus is teaching, and they come out back without Jesus. They go back to him, and, where is he? And even they were amazed. No one ever spoke like this guy. They didn't want to arrest him. So again, we weren't ever able to listen to Jesus and his teaching, but we know from, and there's many other verses that talk about the same thing, that Jesus was an amazing teacher and overwhelmed people with his teaching. So if the chief priests and Pharisees would have just sat down and actually listened to him, they might have learned something. But again, their heart was hard and they didn't learn. But anyway, the point of all this is, even after the Sermon on the Mount and many other places, you see the reaction of people to Jesus' teaching, that they were overwhelmed and amazed with his teaching. But there's something here that we read in Matthew 7 that tells us in one way why he was an amazing teacher. What was that? What did we read in Matthew 7 that might tell us how he taught that made people listen? Roger?
He had authority.
Yeah, he spoke with authority. It says in verse 29 there in Matthew 7 that we already read, "For he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes." And we also read the same thing in Mark 1, verse 22. Same idea was. So he taught with authority. And he taught with confidence. Jesus was very, very assertive when he taught, wasn't he? He didn't say perhaps or maybe. When he said something, he'd just come out and say it like it was, because he knew. Yes, go ahead, Bob.
On that exact point, in the first chapter of Genesis, in the beginning, God created. He's not wishy-washy about might, could, or maybe. God created. There you go. One with authority. That's how he did it.
Right? And to the people that were listening, that would have been maybe, that's why they were amazed. This guy taught with one having authority. Since we study the Bible, we know that Jesus was there in the beginning. When God created through Jesus. So he knows all this. There's no reason for him there's no doubt in Jesus' mind, because he knows he's there. He is Jesus. He's the Son of God, and he's doing the Father's will. But these people are just hearing this guy talk, and he talks in a different way than the scribes were. They didn't. And I think Chris brought this up Wednesday evening, and I think Katie said, yeah, the scribes, maybe they taught in a way that was wishy-washy. They weren't confident in what they were teaching, maybe, or anyway, Jesus was confident. He knew, because he'd been there and he created everything. So he had that confidence and he knew what was going on. Jerry?
I guess that they weren't telling the truth.
Well, we don't know if that's true or not. We know the scribes had some problems, and they were with the Pharisees and did some things wrong.
With authority and the truth, that tells me that they weren't speaking with the whole truth.
Well, we know that the Pharisees were teaching things, but they didn't. They were going through the motions in some ways. Yeah. Dad, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was just gonna say the same thing that Joe just said there, because Jesus was teaching with authority, and everything he said, if any of these people knew the Old Testament law, Yeah, that's what they said. Not what they're teaching us, the scribes and the Pharisees, because they were teaching the doctrines of men. So some of them, oh yeah, I remember that was in the old law. So they're just astonished that this is somebody who's coming along and giving them something different, but then they knew that was right, especially the ones that.
The way he taught, and his heart was in it. He knew what was being said was true, right? I mean, he went through all this. He was there in the Old Testament too. We read about Christ being there and different things. So yeah, he knew what was going on, and he was part of it. Yes, go ahead.
He said himself several times in the Bible when they were complaining about what he said, that I only speak what the Father tells me to say. So every word out of his mouth came straight from God. That's the only words he spoke. It was God himself speaking to God.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Katie?
In some of the references I read, it said that the Pharisees and the Sadducees would self-authenticate their teachings with human leaders, rabbinical leaders. And Christ didn't do any of that. He just spoke with authority. He didn't use anyone to back up his claim.
Right. And if he did use anything, it was scripture. Right. He didn't use someone else. Right. Exactly. So we went through the whole Sermon on the Mount. We've got all the studying and the lessons, and I think I really enjoyed it. But I want to go back and look at a few verses to show how he taught. There was no wishy-washy about it. And he used himself many, many times. He says, I, or me, or, it wasn't somebody else said or whatever said, like we were just talking about. He didn't reference somebody else. I say, or I'm going to do this, or me. And again, because he had this authority. So let's turn back to Matthew chapter 5. We're just going to go through and read a few verses that show how he taught. And you can see the confidence and how assertive Jesus was. And sometimes I think maybe as teachers, maybe we're not assertive enough. Maybe we're trying to be too politically correct at times. Jesus wasn't that way. Did he call the Pharisees serpents, hypocrites? He came around and said that wouldn't be very good for us to do if we're trying to teach someone, I realize. But there's times we need to be assertive. When God's word said, like John 14:15, if you love me, keep my commandments. That's assertive, isn't it? And that's what we need to teach. If we love Jesus, we're going to follow his law. We need to be assertive that way. And some people take that the wrong way if you're trying to be assertive. But anyway, in Matthew chapter 5, I'm just going to we'll just read verse 3 for now, and you can get the idea here. Dad, would you read that, Matthew 5, verse 3?
Blessed are the poor in sight, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
And we went through these, and my point is, it says, for theirs is. Didn't say perhaps, maybe, if you do this, it'd be a good idea. No, blessed are these, for theirs is. And we read the exact same wording in verse 10. If you're persecuted for righteousness' sake, theirs is the kingdom of God. Very dogmatic, very assertive. And from verses 4 through 9, it says, they shall. Not perhaps, not maybe, they shall. This is the way it's going to be. And people responded to this kind of teaching. This is the way it is. So we can see that, how Jesus was taught with confidence, knew what he was talking about, and was very assertive. Now in Matthew, we're right here in Matthew 5. Let's read verse 11. Mom, would you read that?
Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake.
Okay, blessed are you, and why? When someone says all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Again, using himself, not someone else to reference. Me, I'm there. I'm the one teaching, and you need to listen to me. In verse 17, do not think that I came to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Again, that assertiveness, and that's me. I'm not referring to somebody else. We need to do this. And then in Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 6, he says, I say, and Chris has brought this up before, for assuredly I say to you, he's telling them the way it is. He's not, again, not wishy-washy at all, is he? This is, and verse 21, you have heard, but I say. You have heard, but I say. And he said this in Matthew chapter 5. He said it in verse 18, verse 20, verse 22, verse 26, 28, 32, 34, 39, 44. He said, I say, but I say. That many times just in one chapter. And then continuing on in chapter 6, verse 2, verse 5, verse 16, verse 25, verse 29. Again, very assertive. You're being taught this, but I say. That's how Jesus taught. And you can see that the people really responded to this kind of teaching. Now let's flip over to chapter 6. And we'll read verse 24. Matthew 6, verse 24. And Sean, would you read that?
No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon.
Okay, again, Jesus teaching, no one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and mammon. Didn't say perhaps, didn't say maybe not, maybe it's a bad idea to try to do both. No, you cannot serve God and mammon. Again, very dogmatic and very assertive in his teaching because he knew. And also we'll read from verse 33 here in Matthew 6. Matthew 6:33. Dave, would you read that?
But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you.
Okay, again, seek his kingdom and all these things. And he talked about not worrying about physical things that we need, clothes and food and shelter. Don't worry about that. Kingdom of God comes first. And if you do that, these things shall be added to you. Didn't say perhaps again, did he? Or maybe. He told them the way it was. And the people really responded to his teaching. We can see that, how assertive and how he knew how authoritative he was, because he did know. And the people listened to him in that way. Is there any comments on how Jesus taught? Chris, go ahead.
It's interesting to me that this was something that he seemed to have always had, that you can even go back to when he was a child, and he was there in Luke chapter 2. It says in verse number 46, and so it was after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking questions. Which, by the way, that by itself is interesting that he was talking to the teachers, just listening to them and asking them questions. But in the very next verse, it says, all who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. So he was not only listening and questioning, but he was answering their questions as well. And then when his parents found him, in verse number 49, he responded, why do you seek me? Do you not know I must be about my Father's business? And he's talking about, of course, Father capitalized, he's talking about God. So even at the age of 12, he was already aware of who he was. He really had a sense of understanding, and he knew what he was talking about at 12.
Right, which, again, amazing. And there's some of those words are overused, some astonishment and amazing, but yeah, the way he taught, and at 12, like Chris said, he already knew what his job was and was out there asking questions and answering questions to those that were the religious leaders at the time, and he's only 12 years old. So again, amazing. But any other thoughts, Carl?
In Matthew 28:18, he says, and Jesus come and spake to them, saying, all power is given unto me in heaven and earth. So he had the authority to teach and say, I say this, I say this. The Father had given him that authority.
Right, and it's already been brought up that he said I, but he also usually went and said, when I'm saying I'm saying what the Father is telling me to say. You know, he still gave the Father the credit. You know, he used I quite often. It was very forceful and assertive in his teaching. Again, he always made sure that they knew what he was teaching came from the Father. So, any more comments?
When did he first know that he was going to be crucified? Does anyone know that?
I don't know, not unless someone knows a verse that I don't know about. And we don't necessarily know at 12 they knew he was going to be crucified, but he knew a lot because he was answering questions. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, I don't know. But we did know when he was going through his ministry that he definitely knew exactly what was going to happen to him and what was going to go along. And he knew Judas was going to betray him. He knew which one. He knew Peter was going to betray him. Deny him. He knew all these things ahead of time. At what point, I don't know if there's any verse that actually tells us that. At what point he actually knew all that. Okay, still talking about that same thing. Let's look at some verses we've talked about recently, but Matthew chapter 7 now. Verses 21 through 23. And Carl, would you read those?
Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works. And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity.
So these people that say, Lord, Lord, who are they going to be talking to?
Christ.
Yeah, it says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, but is going to enter the kingdom, but those who do the will of the Father. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord. In verse 23, and then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Again, just showing his authority. And we know it came from the Father, but just the way he taught. And he ties himself to the Father here, doesn't he? You're going to talk to me, and you're going to say, Lord, Lord, but you're not going to enter the kingdom unless you did the will of my Father. We know from other verses, Jesus is the one that's going to be judging us in the end. But again, he still points to the Father even here. You're going to talk to me, but you better be doing what my Father is telling you to do. So again, just his authoritative way and how he taught. And then verse 24 and 26 that we just studied, therefore whoever hears these sayings of mine, verse 26 says the same thing, who hears these sayings of mine, me, again pointing to himself, just his authoritative and his presence apparently was something else, and people really responded to that. Yes, Carl.
That last word, iniquity, that means lawlessness. They had done something. He didn't say they hadn't done anything good, but there's lawlessness. Lawlessness is they were doing things without authority. But way back when we studied in the Old Testament, when Noah was building an ark, he had to build it the way God said to build it. When they were building the tabernacle and all of the furniture and all of the covering, there was details as to how it had to be done. And there were consequences if they didn't follow those details. Well, God has given us a way, and it says up there in verse 21, that you have to do the will of the Father which is in heaven. God has given us that plan. And if we follow that plan, we won't be accused of doing things without authority. And in the religious world today, you can find everything under the sun taught and practiced, but not with authority from God. In other words, they're working iniquity. They're doing things without authority to do it.
Right, exactly. We're not to do things without authority, are we? I mean, the whole Bible, you go Old or New Testament, it's the same thing, isn't it? You're not to add anything, you're not to take anything away. You're to do exactly what he told them to do. And like Carl said, there was so much detail in that old law and how they had to build this and the size of this and that. They had to follow it exactly to be pleasing in his sight. When God told Noah to make the ark out of gopher wood, did he have to tell him, don't use oak? No, he told them what to use. That means he didn't have to say that, does he? Same with the New Testament. He tells us to sing. He doesn't have to tell us, don't use a musical instrument. He's already told us what to do. So we need to apply all those to our lives and do exactly what he says, to do his will that we talked about. We don't have much time left, but in talking here about in verse 24 and 26, in verse 24, Jesus said, who hears these sayings of mine and does them. Verse 26, who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them. So he did all this teaching. The people were amazed at his teaching, but there was still something they had to do. There was still works that they had to do. They heard him, but there was things that they had to do now. And verse 21 that Carl just brought up, you need to do the will of my Father. Just so there is doing, there's actions that has to happen for us to be pleasing in God's sight. And that exact same thing we need to hear and do is brought out in James chapter 1. So let's flip over there and read a few verses from James. James chapter 1, and we'll read verses 22 through 25. James 1, 22 through 25. And Katie, would you read those?
For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man observing his natural face in a mirror, where he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does.
Okay, who's going to be blessed?
The one who does what he's supposed to do.
The one that hears and does, exactly, not just hearing. Hearing's not enough. And we've read this verse many times. We know this. I just wanted to take the opportunity to bring it up again since class is kind of towards the end here, but we have to hear and do. Jesus came and did his part, and the Father did their part, and we have works that we have to do. And if we hear and we don't do, here we're compared to someone that's looked in a mirror to see what we look like, and we look at it and maybe there's something on it. I didn't wash my face good. There's still something on my face. I look at it and I just walk away. I don't do anything about it. Why did I bother even looking in a mirror? There's things we have to do. If we're looking into a mirror, and again, if we're looking into the perfect law of liberty, we got to continue in it. That means there's actions for us to do, hearing and doing. Let's turn over to Romans chapter 2, and we'll just read verse 13. Romans chapter 2 and verse 13. And Jerry, would you read that?
Which eschew the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience, and being
Jerry?
witness.
Jerry, Romans 2, 13?
Romans 2,
13.
13, I'll read 15. Sorry. For the hearers of the law are judged before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified.
Okay, just another verse. I just want to read a couple verses we have to hear and do. These people that were listening to Jesus and were astonished and overwhelmed by his teaching, there was still something they needed to do. And we know that there were some that did. There was people, he was baptizing a lot of people, but there's some that wouldn't. The same thing happens today as we're up here teaching Jesus' words and the apostles in the New Testament. Those people, when we teach them, there's got to be a response from them one way or another. And we can actually push them too far if we're not careful. But again, they need to hear and do. There's not faith only. We know we're just hearing only isn't enough. And we know that faith only isn't enough. So again, as we teach, and the way we teach, the verses I just read, you have to hear and do. Again, we have to teach that. We have to be assertive in that way. Yeah, you heard. If you feel like it's a good thing to do, no. If you heard the word and you believe it, you need to do something about it. That's the way Jesus would have taught, and that's how we have to teach it also. So, but we can be too assertive, and we don't want to do that either and push people away. But again, we have to teach them the truth. Can't try to soften it. Tell them the truth and tell it how it is. Carl?
You see it, you hear it every day. And people think God's going to save everybody. that if they haven't, beat their wife and kids and they hadn't murdered anybody, they're gonna go to heaven. They keep saying that their ancestors and periods that you're in heaven waiting for me. They don't know God's word because God does not teach that anywhere. In all of these verses, it's here, you gotta follow the pattern.
Exactly. Okay, I'm sure Chris will continue on there in chapter 8 on Wednesday.
Hey. I wonder if there's any left.
Hey, Bob, how are you?
I'm just worried about it. I know.
She is too. She's just not.
That's the bottom line.
What's the latest report?
Latest is that he's doing better.
Where is it?
He's still not. Still sometimes. Last time, where's he?
They were trying to. I don't know if they did. Okay.
Stacy, it's a couple of days ago, she said, that's,
Still there.
he's he said he has good music.
What do you want? You think God? I think.
Looks like spring. Thank you.